All right, so are you ready to, like, really dive deep into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck?
Oh, yeah, totally. I'm fascinated by his approach. It's not your typical self-help stuff.
It's definitely not your grandma's self-help book, that's for sure.
It's more like tough love,
Yep.
but from a friend who's like brutally honest, like someone who's not afraid to tell it like it is.
Exactly. And he's got some pretty wild stories and ideas in there. Like, he uses a talking panda to explain why we should embrace disappointment.
Really? A talking panda.
I know, right? It sounds kind of crazy. But
Right.
it actually makes sense when you hear him explain it. And there's another story about a Japanese soldier who was lost in the jungle for 30 years after World War II. He had no idea the war was over.
Wow. Okay, so those are some pretty extreme examples of commitment, right?
Yeah, I mean, talk about dedication. But before we get to those, let's start with, like, the core idea of the book. The first chapter is called Don't Try, and Manson kicks it off with a story about the poet Charles Bukowski. Have you ever heard of him?
Oh, yeah, I've read some of his stuff. He's known for being like really raw and gritty in his writing.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to, like, expose his flaws and struggles,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably why he had Don't Try engraved on his tombstone.
Mm.
That's not exactly what you'd expect, right?
Yeah, that's not the usual inspirational message you see on tombstones.
You'd think it would be something like reach for the stars or never give up or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But Manson argues that Bukowski's success didn't come from, like, constantly striving for perfection. It came from his, like, radical honesty and self-acceptance, flaws and all.
That's a really interesting perspective. It's like instead of trying to be someone he wasn't, he just embraced who he was. And that's what made him so compelling.
Yeah. And I think it challenges those messages we often get about, always needing to improve ourselves and achieve more. Maybe there's power in just accepting ourselves as we are.
I mean, think about it. Society's always pushing us to like chase more of everything, more money, more possessions, more status. It's exhausting.
Totally. It's like we're on this never-ending treadmill.
But Bukowski's story, it kind of suggests that authenticity might be more valuable than trying to fit into some like idealized mold of success.
So am I getting this right? Manson's saying that maybe our obsession with, like, achieving and optimizing, maybe it's actually making us less happy.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, especially in today's world with social media and all the comparison that goes on.
Oh my gosh, yes. You're constantly bombarded with these, like, picture perfect versions of other people's lives.
Hmm.
It's so easy to feel inadequate.
Exactly. And that's where the subtle art of not giving a feck comes in. It's not about becoming apathetic or anything. It's more about like choosing what actually matters to you and letting go of the rest. All that other stuff that's just noise.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. It's about picking your battles.
Yeah.
But how do you actually do that? Life throws so much at you, and it's easy to get caught up in reacting to everything.
Right, and that's where the feedback loop from hell comes in. Have you ever noticed how you can get stuck in this cycle of like negative thinking?
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like when you're anxious about something,
Yeah.
and then you start feeling bad about being anxious.
Exactly. And then you feel guilty about feeling bad and it just spirals out of control.
Oh, yeah, it's like this downward spiral. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, and Manson's point is that you can't short circuit that loop by like just accepting that you feel bad without judging yourself for it.
Oh, okay, so instead of beating myself up for having those negative thoughts, I should just acknowledge them and, like, move on.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, I know.
Yeah, for sure. It's way easier said than done. So what are some ways to actually break free from those patterns?
Well, practicing mindfulness can help a lot. Things like meditation. It's about learning to observe your thoughts without getting swept away by them.
So you create, like, some distance between you and those negative thoughts so you can choose how you want to respond.
Exactly. You're not just reacting on autopilot. You have a choice.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about how those negative thought patterns can, like, trap us. But how do we actually break free and, start tackling life's challenges head on? Is that where the talking panda comes in?
Yes. That's where Disappointment Panda enters the picture. He's like the brutally honest superhero we all need.
I have to admit, when I first read about this disappointment panda, I was a little skeptical.
It does sound kind of out there, right?
Yeah. I mean, who wants to think of life as just one problem after another? It sounds kind of depressing.
I know. But what if, instead of dreading problems, we started to see them as opportunities for growth?
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
But how do we tell the difference between, like, good problems and bad problems?
That's a really important question. Good problems are the challenges we choose to take on, struggles that align with our values and help us grow. Bad problems, on the other hand, they come from avoiding responsibility or trying to be someone we're not.
So it's not about trying to avoid problems altogether. It's about choosing the right problems to tackle.
Yes, exactly. And it's the process of solving those problems, of overcoming those challenges, that brings us satisfaction and happiness. Manson uses a really great analogy here. He compares it to rock climbing.
Oh, I love that analogy. A climber intentionally chooses challenging routes
Yeah.
because that's what makes the climb worthwhile, right? They don't just look for the easiest way up.
Right. It's about embracing the challenge, pushing your limits, and through that process, you grow and develop new skills.
So just like the rock climber, we kind of define ourselves by what we're willing to struggle for in life. I remember when I decided to learn guitar.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was not easy at first. Sore fingertips, frustrating chords, hours and hours of practice. But pushing through those challenges was so rewarding.
And I bet there's a lasting sense of satisfaction that comes from knowing you put in the work and achieve something you set out to do.
Absolutely. It wasn't about becoming a rock star or anything. It was about the journey, the challenge, the process of learning.
That's awesome. So how do you think this idea of like choosing your struggles applies to other areas of life, like relationships or careers?
Well, I think it's about figuring out which struggles actually align with your values, the things that are truly important to you, and then embracing those challenges. And that brings us to another key concept from the book, the importance of values and metrics.
Ooh, yes. That's a good one.
I remember Manson talks about values being like what's important to us, and metrics being how we measure our success in relation to those values.
Yeah.
Why is it so important to make sure those are aligned?
Because if you choose the wrong metrics, it can lead to a lot of unhappiness and frustration. He uses the example of Dave Mustaine, the guitarist and vocalist for Megadeth.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Mustaine got kicked out of Metallica early on, and even after he achieved success with Megadeth, he still seemed to measure his worth by comparing himself to Metallica.
Right, and he was constantly trying to prove himself to be more successful than his former bandmates. That became his metric, and it ultimately led to a lot of resentment.
It's like you're always chasing someone else's definition of success, which never really works out.
It doesn't. It's a recipe for misery. And then Manson contrasts Mustaine's experience with Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles.
Oh, wow. Imagine getting fired from the Beatles right before they hit it big.
Right. Talk about a what-if moment. But Best actually ended up finding happiness, not by dwelling on the past or comparing herself to the Beatles' success, but by shifting his values and choosing different metrics.
So instead of focusing on fame and fortune, he found meaning in family, stability, playing music on his own terms.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how choosing the right values and metrics can have a huge impact on your well-being. So think about this. What are your values and metrics?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we even figure those things out?
Start by asking yourself, what's truly important to you? What principles guide your decisions? What do you want to stand for?
Okay, so once you figure out your values, then you can start thinking about the metrics. How are you measuring your progress toward those values?
Yeah, are you measuring yourself against external standards like Mustaine did, or are you focusing on internal metrics like Best did, aligning your goals with what truly matters to you?
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot of ground already. We talked about embracing imperfections, choosing our struggles, and aligning our values with our metrics. What's next?
Well, next up, we're going to dive into Manson's take on love and relationships. Get ready for some controversy.
Oh, yeah. This should be interesting. He uses Romeo and Juliet to argue that they're actually terrible role models for healthy relationships.
I know, right? Not exactly what you'd expect, but he makes a really compelling case. We'll talk about why saying no and setting boundaries are so important and how to tell the difference between healthy and unhealthy love.
This is going to be good, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break. All right, so we're back and ready to tackle, like, Manson's take on love and relationships. I got to admit, when I first read this chapter, I was like, whoa, this is not what I was expecting.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't hold back. It's not your typical lovey-dovey relationship advice.
No, for sure. He uses Romeo and Juliet, of all things, to show how these characters are actually, like, terrible role models for healthy relationships.
I know, right? It's kind of funny when you think about it. They're like the ultimate romantic tragedy.
But they're also incredibly impulsive and reckless, right? They make all these crazy decisions based on, like, intense passion.
And it doesn't exactly end well for them, does it?
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Everyone dies. Not exactly the happily ever after we're usually sold in romantic stories.
And Manson uses that example to, like, highlight why saying no and setting boundaries is actually crucial for a healthy relationship.
So it's not about being, like, cold or uncaring. It's about recognizing that healthy love needs a sense of responsibility and a willingness to, reject and be rejected.
Yeah, and it's not just about being able to say no to a partner. It's also about being okay with them saying no to you.
Oh, that's interesting. So both people need to feel comfortable setting boundaries and respecting each other's boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. Because we're all individuals with our own needs and values, right? And sometimes those things might clash. And that's okay. It's about navigating those differences in a healthy way.
So I'm curious, how does Manson actually define, like, the difference between healthy and unhealthy love? Especially from your perspective, working with couples, you must see a lot of different dynamics.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think one key difference is like how you handle problems and responsibility in a relationship. Unhealthy love often involves trying to escape your problems or using the relationship as a crutch. You try to outsource your happiness to your partner.
Oh, so it's like instead of dealing with your own issues, you expect your partner to fix them for you,
Yeah.
or you try to fix their issues for them.
Exactly. And that never really works, does it?
No, not in the long run, at least. So with healthy love, it's about owning your own problems and working through them, ideally with your partner's support, but not expecting them to solve everything for you.
Right. It's not about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who supports you in becoming a more whole and complete person on your own.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It ties into the whole boundaries thing we were talking about. So in a healthy relationship, each person takes responsibility for their own feelings and actions without trying to control their partner.
Exactly. In unhealthy relationships, you often see a lot of codependency, where one person's emotional well-being is totally dependent on the other person's mood.
So with healthy boundaries, each person is responsible for their own emotions and allows their partner to do the same.
Precisely. It's about mutual respect and understanding, not control and manipulation.
So let's talk about those boundaries a bit more. What are some signs that someone might have, like, poor boundaries in a relationship?
Well, one red flag is when someone constantly takes responsibility for their partner's emotions, like always apologizing for their partner's bad mood or trying to cheer them up when they're down.
Oh, so they're not letting their partner own their own feelings.
Right, and that creates a dynamic where one person feels responsible for the other person's happiness, which is way too much pressure for anyone.
Yeah, and it's not sustainable in the long run. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. What are some other signs?
Another one is demanding that their partner take responsibility for their emotions. Like, saying things like, you made me feel this way, or you need to make me happy.
Wow, yeah. That sounds like a surefire way to create resentment.
It is. Remember, healthy relationships are built on respect and understanding, not control.
Manson also makes this point that rejection is actually a healthy part of relationships. Could you elaborate on that? Because it seems kind of counterintuitive. Aren't we supposed to avoid rejection at all costs?
I know, it sounds strange, but Manson argues that rejection is actually essential for setting healthy boundaries. It's about being able to say no to things that don't align with your values, to not get swept up in someone else's drama.
So it's not about being, like, mean or hurtful. It's about being honest and standing up for yourself.
Exactly. And in the long run, that honesty can actually make relationships stronger.
So we've talked about saying no and setting boundaries. Now I'm curious to hear what Manson has to say about commitment.
Well, this might surprise you, but he actually argues that commitment, while seemingly limiting, can actually create freedom.
Oh, is this like the paradox of choice, where having too many options can lead to less satisfaction because you get overwhelmed and you're never sure if you made the right choice?
You got it. And Manson uses his own life as an example. He talks about committing to writing, to his relationship, to living in one place.
So do you think by making those commitments, he was actually limiting his choices, or did it actually free him up to accomplish more?
I think it was the latter. By making those commitments, he was able to focus his energy and avoid getting distracted by all those what ifs that can hold us back.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like that idea that less is more. Sometimes narrowing your focus allows you to go deeper and create something truly meaningful.
Exactly. It's like clearing out all the mental clutter and creating space for what really matters. And, it's something I've experienced in my own life too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I used to jump around from one project to the next, always chasing the next shiny object. But when I committed to focusing on my writing, it was like a whole new level of creativity opened up. All that scattered energy became focused.
I love that. So it's not about restricting yourself. It's about choosing a direction and then putting all your energy into it.
Yes. And it allows you to really go deep, to invest in something wholeheartedly. And I think that's what Manson is getting at. Commitment doesn't have to be a burden. It can be incredibly empowering.
It's about choosing what you want to dedicate yourself to and then, like, going all in.
Exactly. So here's a question for you listening. Are there any areas in your life where you feel like more commitment could actually bring you more freedom? It's worth thinking about.
Okay, so we've talked about love, rejection, commitment. Manson covers a lot of ground in this book. Where do we go from here?
Well, in the last part of our deep dive, Manson gets really philosophical. He grapples with some big questions about death, meaning, and legacy. It gets pretty
Oh,
intense.
yeah, I remember this part. He starts by sharing a story about the death of his friend Josh.
Yeah, and it really forces him to confront his own mortality and think about what he wants his life to stand for. It's a powerful chapter.
It is. And he brings in the work of Ernest Becker, who explored the idea of death terror. I have to admit, I wasn't familiar with Becker before reading The Subtle Art.
Oh, interesting. Well, Becker's idea is that our awareness of death, of our own impermanence, actually drives a lot of our behavior. We create these immortality projects,
Mm.
ways to try to leave a mark on the world and transcend our physical limitations.
So whether it's through achievements, relationships, or leaving a legacy behind, we're all trying to find meaning in the face of our own, inevitable demise.
That's the basic idea. But Manson, building on Becker's work, suggests that the key isn't to cling desperately to those immortality projects. It's about accepting death and using that awareness to inform our choices.
So instead of fearing death, we should use it as a motivation to, live more fully in the present moment.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself those tough questions. What is my legacy? How will the world be different because I was here? And it's not about achieving something grand or becoming famous. It's about living in alignment with your values, making choices that matter, and contributing in a way that feels authentic.
That reminds me of the part where Manson talks about sitting on the edge of a cliff in South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope.
Hmm.
He uses that experience as a metaphor for, confronting your fears and limitations.
Oh, yes. That's such a powerful image. He talks about feeling the full weight of his own mortality.
And what was his takeaway from that experience? What did he learn from staring into the abyss, so to speak?
He realized that by accepting death, by accepting that we're all impermanent, life can actually feel less scary and more meaningful.
It's like you have to die a few times before you can really live, right? It sounds morbid, but it's true in a way.
Yeah, it's about shedding those layers of ego and insecurity that hold us back from fully experiencing life. And I think that's really the essence of Manson's message, isn't it? To live authentically, choose your struggles wisely, and embrace this whole human experience with all its beauty and fragility.
Well said. It's definitely a message that resonates deeply. So as we move into the final part of our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fake, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will, walk away with today?
Well, I hope they remember that they are not their thoughts and emotions. Don't get caught in that feedback loop from hell. Acknowledge those negative thoughts, but don't let them define you.
And remember to choose your struggles wisely, right? Focus your energy on the things that truly matter to you and let go of the rest. You can't do everything.
Right, you have to prioritize. And don't be afraid to set boundaries in your relationships. Healthy love requires responsibility and the willingness to both reject and be rejected. It's about finding someone who supports you in becoming your best self, not someone who tries to fix you or control you.
And embrace commitment. Even though it might seem counterintuitive, by focusing your energy on what really matters, you actually find more freedom and opportunity.
Absolutely. It's about going deep, investing in your passions, and experiencing the rewards that come with that dedication. And finally, remember that death is a part of life. Use it as a guiding principle to clarify your values and live a more meaningful life.
Those are all really powerful reminders. So for our listeners who are intrigued by Manson's ideas, what's the next step? What should they do if they want to explore this further?
Well, I highly recommend picking up a copy of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck and diving in. There's so much to unpack in this book, and I guarantee you'll find insights that resonate with your own experiences.
And it's not just about reading the book, right? It's about putting these ideas into practice.
You're exactly right. It's about taking those insights and using them to create a life that's more authentic, more meaningful, and ultimately more fulfilling.
It's like he's saying it's okay to not care about everything, right?
Yeah.
Like we can't possibly give a feck about everything, or we'd just be like completely overwhelmed.
Totally, yeah. It's more about being selective, about figuring out what actually matters to you and then really focusing your energy on those things.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the subtle art, what are some of the, I guess, most important things you hope people listening will take away from all this?
Well, first and foremost, I really hope they remember that they're not like defined by their thoughts and emotions. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
We talked about that feedback loop from hell, remember? Don't
Mm.
get stuck there. See those negative thoughts, acknowledge them, but don't let them run the show.
It's like we're creating space, right, between us and those thoughts. Kind of like we were talking about with mindfulness.
Exactly, yeah. It's like
Yeah.
learning to step back and choose how you want to respond, not just like knee-jerk reacting to every little thing.
Okay, so besides that, what else should we be keeping in mind as we try to figure out this whole not giving effect thing?
Well, remember how we were talking about choosing your struggles, like that rock climber analogy?
Oh, yeah.
Make sure you're putting your energy towards stuff that, actually aligns with your values, the stuff that's really important to you. And honestly, it's totally fine to let go of the rest.
Yeah, you can't do it all.
Nope, you gotta prioritize. And on that note, remember how we talked about values and metrics? Don't get sucked into comparing yourself to everyone else or chasing external validation. Define success on your own terms.
Oh, for sure. It's
Yeah.
way too easy to fall into that trap, especially nowadays.
Totally. And speaking of relationships, remember boundaries. Those are key. Healthy love is about being responsible, about being willing to say no and to hear no sometimes.
It's about finding that balance between vulnerability, like being open, and also, standing up for what you need and what you believe in.
Yeah, exactly. And, it might seem kind of weird, but remember what Manson says about commitment. Focusing your energy on what truly matters can actually open up like so much more freedom and possibility.
I love that idea, like shutting some doors so that others can swing wide open, right?
Yeah.
And on that note, I think Manson's message about death, even though it's, kind of heavy, is really powerful and important.
Definitely. He's basically saying, hey, death is a part of life. Don't be afraid of it. Use that knowledge, to help you figure out what you really value and how you want to live.
Yeah, instead of being scared, we can use it as like a guiding force.
Mm.
It could help us make the most of our time.
Right. Ask yourself the big questions. What's my legacy going to be? How will the world be different because I was here? And it's not about, becoming super famous or anything. It's about making choices that matter, living in line with what you believe in, and contributing in a way that feels true to you.
So after spending all this time like really digging into Manson's book, I kind of feel, I don't know if optimistic is the right word, but definitely more empowered, maybe. Like we actually have more control over our happiness than we think.
That's awesome. I love that. And I hope that's what everyone listening takes away from this. A sense of hope, a sense of purpose, and maybe like the courage to just be yourself, even if it means challenging expectations or going against the grain.
So what now? What should our listeners do if they're, into Manson's ideas and they want to keep exploring?
Honestly, go grab a copy of The Subtle Art and dive in. There's so much to discover in there. I bet you'll find stuff that really speaks to you.
And it's not just about reading, right? It's about actually doing something with what you learn.
Absolutely. Take those insights and use them to build a life that feels, real and meaningful and fulfilling.
So to wrap this whole thing up, if you're feeling stressed out by all the pressures of modern life, if you feel lost or unsure about what you're doing, or even if you just want a fresh perspective on, happiness and success, I really think Manson's book is worth checking out. It might just change the way you see things.
Yeah, don't try to be perfect. Don't worry about having it all figured out. Embrace the messiness of life, Choose your struggles wisely and focus on what truly matters.
And that, my friends, is the subtle art of not giving a feck. Thanks for tuning in to our deep dive. We'll catch you next time.